G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with episode 22 in my partial book reading of One Crowded Hour, Tim Bowden's biography of Neil Davis, the combat cameraman who died in 1985. This is the second part of chapter 18, Death is a Lady. And to recap, the war in Vietnam was fought mainly for the countryside off the main highways. The reverse was true in Cambodia, where the fighting was for control of the main highways. When Davis first arrived in Phnom Penh to cover the war in 1970, he was told, just go down any road. There were 7 main highways radiating out of Phnom Penh and they all led to the war. Generally, I went by car, and when it got too close to the front, I would pick up a motorcycle taxi service to take you to the war. Some boys from Phnom Penh or the country towns were running this service to get you right within 200 or 300 metres of the fighting. It was a remarkable scene. The noodle sellers were there too. They would be less than 2 kilometres from the fighting, selling noodles to the soldiers and their families and to the correspondents, and sometimes sightseers as well. The Cambodians never had the sophisticated equipment that the Americans gave the South Vietnamese. In Davis's view, they fought better without it. They were on equal terms, fighting in the mud and slush of the paddy fields with the communists. In the first 2 years of war, however, they mounted frontal assaults on the enemy because they believed these unnerved them. The Viet Cong had never faced an enemy like the Cambodians. The great spirit of the Cambodians carried them to some early victories, but soon the heavy casualties began to take their toll. The people had to evacuate the villages and move into the cities, creating a refugee problem. The Cambodian army never recovered from the first 6 months of devastation and heavy attacks by the Vietnamese communists, during which they lost 2/3 of the Cambodian countryside. But they never lost their fighting spirit, despite defeats and setbacks. Neil Davis's camera recorded the cheerful cavalcades of young Cambodians setting off for the front on buses, open trucks, motorcycles and 3-wheeled cyclos. All too often they returned dead on the same transport on the same day. The naive enthusiasm of the boy and girl soldiers was heartbreaking. Worse, the war was often a family affair, with wives and small children accompanying husbands or fighting sons to the front. At the end of the day, Davis filmed poignant scenes. A Cambodian soldier weeping after the death of his wife, holding his surviving 5-year-old son, or a dazed and suddenly orphaned 6-year-old girl left absolutely alone in a strange and violent world. The boy soldiers used to fish and climb coconut trees between actions. They may have carried lethal weapons, but they were just kids. A Cambodian major told me once, if we don't let them join, they cry. There was a nice rapport between the adults and the boy soldiers. The men would rather have been home farming or fishing too. They had no sophisticated means of gathering intelligence in the field, so a soldier would put on civilian clothes, hide a couple of hand grenades under his shirt, and cycle off down the road to find out where the communists were. If he was lucky, he got back with the intelligence, or he died. This well-meaning amateurism was potentially lethal for war correspondents, and a whole new set of survival rules had to be learned. Davis knew he could depend on the bravery of the soldiers he was with, and that they would not break and run, leaving him stranded. But they often died to the last man, and that was little comfort. There was sparse cover in the open paddy country, and a tiny depression in the ground on a low paddy dyke could determine life or death. The only way to advance over open fields was to run, and I had to run with them. It was far more dangerous to stay back. They would move to close quarters and throw grenades. They had the unnerving habit of standing up to fire at the enemy so they could see better. It made them better targets too. Girls would often be among the frontline troops, and they fought well too. The Cambodian troops always tried valiantly to recover the bodies of their dead and wounded, in the absence of any organised army medical service. Only the families could tend the wounded, and the Cambodians believed it important for the dead to be farewelled with the proper Buddhist ceremony. This was one of the main reasons their families came out so close to the action. as well as to provide food and moral support. Later in the conflict, the Khmer Rouge, who had thrown away all their religious beliefs, would deliberately mutilate the bodies. And that was bad from a Cambodian point of view, because that mutilation, they believed, stayed with them in the afterlife. In the case of reincarnation, it prevented their bodies from going whole into the second life. It made the Cambodian government soldiers fight very hard and not give ground. They fought and fought and fought long after a Western army would have retreated in similar circumstances. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 22 November 1971, apartment 403, Phnom Penh. Had a good coverage yesterday of Khmers on top of a hill fighting and unfortunately losing their position to the communists. But they were really magnificent in defeat. Today's papers are full of it, in much the same way that Australia's biggest military day commemorates their Gallipoli defeat. Well, you know, Auntie, it wasn't a big battle, but that matters very little, really. We had about 100 soldiers along with some of their wives and children. Bracket, very common here and in Vietnam. 20 were killed, plus 4 or 5 of their dependents, and 50% of the remainder were wounded. But they held on and eventually drove back the communists, but were so depleted that they had to make a sorrowful withdrawal, carrying the wounded and leaving the dead on an 8-kilometre trek. So I don't blame them for casting their soldiers as being heroic in defeat. I didn't hear a harsh or bitter word. Not one of them or their families became hysterical or tried to break and run. In moments of extreme danger and tension, often before charging an enemy position, Khmer soldiers put the image of a Buddha worn around their necks into their mouths. In this frame from Davis's action footage, tension and fear are clearly evident on the face of this soldier. I hear the Iranians used to give their boy soldiers a plastic key to wear on a chain around their neck, telling them it was the key to the gates of the kingdom of paradise. The Cambodians carried a protective image of the Buddha slung around their necks in moments of extreme stress, in close combat, or when about to make a final charge on an enemy position. They held the Buddha in their mouths. Davis was sometimes seen to bite on a Buddha too. During this time, he achieved the most graphic combat footage of his career. The unit he accompanied was surrounded, with waves of communist troops coming in on all sides. I couldn't film everything I saw because I was trying to save my own life. The film reveals a look of uncertainty on the faces of the troops because they weren't sure where the enemy was. The Buddhas were in their mouths, though, so they were close. Sometimes the communist positions were overrun so quickly that the communist soldiers were coming up behind the advancing troops. On this occasion, I found myself right on top of a bunker with a communist soldier inside. He showed himself once and went back inside. One of our soldiers threw a grenade in the bunker, and at the same instant, the communist soldier shot him dead. It was exhausting fighting with temperatures approaching 100 degrees Fahrenheit, about 37 degrees Celsius. In this particular action, there were 50 government soldiers killed, but they won the battle. Hand-to-hand fighting did take place in these skirmishes. It came at the climax of the battle when the Cambodians or the communist troops rushed in from 15 or 20 metres to overrun the other's position. There was a lot of grenade throwing and quite often some actual grappling with the opposing soldiers. They didn't use the bayonet very much, but sometimes swung their rifles like a club. I was never actually able to film that because by that stage I was too busy trying to stay alive. Had I tried to film it, I'm sure I would have been killed on the first or second occasion I tried it. Although the Cambodians were mainly Buddhists, their religion had some overtones of Hinduism. Davis believed that because they lived close to the soil, they had the, quote, sixth sense he believed he shared in highly charged moments. To the Cambodians, death did not come as the Grim Reaper. The Cambodians had a saying, "Death is a lady. She might appear as a laughing girl or an older woman, but she was a very gentle, warm lady who was there to protect them even in death." During one very dangerous and close contact within about 20 metres of the communist forces outside Phnom Penh, I was lying behind a paddy dyke watching the young Cambodian soldier nearest to me. He had his necklace Buddha image in his mouth, ready to move forward in the attack, and I saw his eyes go out of focus, as though he was thinking about something. He caught my eye and laughed, saying, "She's here, she's here," and he laughed again. His glimpse of the Death Lady was a happy one for him. She had come to protect him. Another combat cine cameraman who worked for Viz News, Tom Aspel, believed that Davis never took what he regarded as an unacceptable risk. Davis was with him during a number of actions in Cambodia and Vietnam. He says, "I don't think I ever once saw Neil run a road or a wall or a paddy field without first spending a lot of time watching and waiting, checking where the fire was coming from and waiting for the safest moment to move. He sometimes sat for hours in one place without rolling a frame of film while others moved around. It didn't stop him getting hit a few times, but that was the way he worked. When he did move, he always looked for dead ground or shelter to take cover behind if something happened. He did this even in safe areas." I remember this very clearly because on one occasion we were in a fight in a clearing a few kilometres east of Phnom Penh. There were mortars landing and a lot of small arms fire directed at the company of soldiers we were with. It was reasonably safe to crawl around. The company commander was moving from position to position, trying to get his men to return the fire. At one stage his wristwatch was shot off, but he kept moving. I crawled around a bit too. It went on for a good 3 hours, but during that time Neil did not move. When we eventually did get out, I asked him why he hadn't moved to film, and he replied that in his judgment it had not been safe to move at any time. Besides, he added, there were fights going on every day, and there would always be safer and more spectacular ones to cover. Aspel said that Davis had been absolutely right. His own film looked exactly the same that day as it did most other days, and he had never been more scared in his life. He says, "Another battle on a different highway produced what I think was one of Neil's best one-liners. We were working in the same area as government forces prepared to launch an all-out attack on a Khmer Rouge position in the middle of a large flat plain. It was one of those days when you seem to be able to get every single weapon in the world's arsenal performing for the cameras. First aerial attacks by T-28 aircraft dropping great big bombs which set the village on fire with black smoke everywhere. Then helicopters using rockets and miniguns poured tracer through the air. Then came the armour, APCs rumbling through the paddies firing machine guns, followed by the infantry running and firing. The whole plain looked like a scene out of a David Lean movie. I mentioned this to Neil, who replied, 'Yeah, but we could do with a few wounded to round it out.'" Documentary filmmaker Jim Gerand said that Davis always warned his colleagues against becoming involved in assisting either side. Once a Cambodian radio operator was having enormous difficulty in directing an American radio operator where there should be an airstrike. Because of the confusion over the French word ami for friendly and enemy, the operator succeeded in directing the airstrike on his own position. Jim Gerand said, "With the poor Cambodian scared out of his wits, I spoke on the radio to the Americans to call off the strike, explaining that he was using the friendly, not the enemy coordinates. Neil later ticked me off for this, and he had every right to do. The press had to keep their noses absolutely clean, trying like the Red Cross to be absolutely apolitical in the field because of the risk that the communist forces would show no sympathy or respect for captured reporters. In fact, few captured reporters survived capture by the Khmer Rouge, and Neil Davis himself was once forced to pick up a weapon and help defend a Cambodian government position that was about to be overrun. He knew prisoners were seldom taken. Our position was being overrun and at least 1/3 of the defending troops had been killed. Many more were seriously wounded and 4 or 5 Cambodian soldiers and myself were cut off. There was no way but to pick up a weapon and help defend the position, which we fortunately did successfully to enable us to escape. That action was over in a few minutes, but it took us 3 days to get out. I always thought such a situation would pose a moral question. In actual fact, there was no moral question in my mind. It was either be killed or defend myself. And I chose to defend myself. I only did that on 2 occasions in the battlefield. I could have done it dozens of times if I had wanted to. I was shot at many times in close combat situations, and all I did was duck. And most of the time, he kept rolling. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Sorry about the rain on the roof. Ciao.